She was too educated, too opinionated, too old to be broken into submission. At 52, Lady Arabella Whitcroft had survived a loveless marriage, burying a husband who never saw her as more than decoration. Now, thousands of miles from England's glittering ballrooms, she stands in a dusty Arizona parlor while Victor Caldwell delivers his verdict. She is unwanted, not for lacking beauty or fortune, but for possessing a mind that refuses to be quieted. Outside the door, a cowboy overhears words that will change both their lives forever. Follow this story to the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far Arabella's journey reaches across the world. The Arizona heat pressed against the windows of the Caldwell house like an unwelcome visitor, thick and suffocating even as afternoon bled toward evening. Arabella Whitcroft sat perfectly upright in a chair that creaked beneath her weight. Her traveling dress, once deep burgundy, now faded to something closer to rust, clinging to her back with perspiration. Her hands lay folded in her lap, fingers interlaced with the practiced composure of 30 years navigating London's most ruthless drawing rooms. But this wasn't London, and Victor Caldwell was not a gentleman. He stood by the window, broad-shouldered and imposing, his back to her as he stared out at the dusty expanse of his property. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Arabella had learned to read silences the way other women read tea leaves. This one reeked of dismissal. "I'll be direct, Lady Whitcroft," Caldwell said finally, his voice flat. He didn't turn around. "This arrangement won't work." Arabella's spine stiffened, though her expression remained serene. "I see. May I ask why?" "You may ask?" He turned then, his weathered face unreadable. "But I suspect you already know." She met his gaze without flinching. "I'm afraid I don't traffic in assumptions, Mr. Caldwell. If you have grievances, I'd prefer them stated plainly." Something flickered across his face, irritation perhaps, or grudging respect. "You're too much, ma'am. Too educated, too opinionated, too goddamn articulate for a woman who's supposed to be running a household. I was under the impression that intelligence was an asset, not a liability." "In a man, maybe." Caldwell crossed his arms. "In a wife? It's a complication I don't need. I've built everything I have from nothing. I need someone who'll support that, not question every decision I make." Arabella felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd heard these words before. Different phrasing, same sentiment. Her late husband Edward had been more subtle about it, couching his disdain in polite society's language. But the message was identical. Be less. Think less. Speak less. "I answered your advertisement in good faith," she said quietly. "I traveled 3,000 miles. And I'm compensating you for the journey." Caldwell gestured toward an envelope on the side table. "There's enough there for passage back to San Francisco, plus extra. I'm not a cruel man, Lady Whitcroft. Just practical." A practical. The word tasted bitter. "You're dismissing me because I refuse to pretend stupidity?" "I'm dismissing you because I need a partner, not a rival." His voice hardened. "You're 52 years old, ma'am. At your age, a woman should understand her place, should be grateful for security, not constantly challenging the man providing it." There it was. The unspoken truth that had shadowed her entire adult life, now spoken aloud with brutal clarity. Too old. Too difficult. Too much herself to be wanted. Arabella rose with deliberate grace, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Caldwell. It saves us both considerable time." She picked up the envelope without looking at it, tucked it into her reticule, and walked toward the door. Her legs felt distant, mechanical. Behind her, Caldwell cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, you're a handsome woman. Refined. Any man would be lucky to have you as an ornament." Arabella paused, her hand on the doorknob. She didn't turn around. "Mr. Caldwell, I have been an ornament. For 30 years I decorated my husband's life while my mind atrophied from disuse. I buried him 18 months ago, and I promised myself I would never again shrink to fit someone else's comfort." She pulled the door open. "I wish you well in finding a woman willing to make herself small enough for your liking." The door clicked shut behind her with a finality that echoed through her bones. The late afternoon sun hit her like a physical blow. Arabella stood on the porch, momentarily blinded, her composure finally cracking at the edges. She'd sold everything: her London townhouse, her late husband's collection of rare books, jewelry that had been in the Whitcroft family for generations, all of it liquidated to fund this desperate gamble at reinvention. And now what? She descended the porch steps carefully, her traveling boots stirring small clouds of dust. The town of Copper Springs sprawled before her, a collection of wooden buildings that seemed to lean into each other for support. Nothing like the stone permanence of England's architecture. Everything here felt temporary, as if the desert could reclaim it all in a single windstorm. A horse nickered softly to her left. Arabella turned and found herself being studied by a man she hadn't noticed before, probably because he'd clearly been trying not to be noticed. He sat on a worn saddle atop a paint horse, his hat pulled low, but she could see the sharp intelligence in his eyes. Mid-40s, she guessed, lean and weathered, with the kind of stillness that suggested he saw more than most people realized. "Ma'am," he touched the brim of his hat. "Daniel Mercer. I'm the foreman at Red Mesa Ranch." Lady Arabella Whitcroft. The title felt absurd here, pretentious, but it was her name, and she'd be damned if she'd apologize for it. "I know who you are." Mercer's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Been sitting here about 20 minutes. Couldn't help overhearing." Humiliation burned through her chest. "I see." "Don't think you do, ma'am." He shifted in his saddle. "I heard what Caldwell said. Also heard how you answered him. That took spine." Arabella lifted her chin. "Mr. Mercer, if you're here to offer pity, I'm here to offer you a job." That stopped her. She blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I beg your pardon?" Mercer dismounted with an easy grace that came from a lifetime in the saddle. Up close, she could see the small details: the scar bisecting his left eyebrow, the calluses on his hands, the way his eyes held hers without challenge or dominance. Just directness. "Red Mesa Ranch is about 15 miles northwest of here," he said. "We've got 40 hands, 3 dozen head of cattle, and half a dozen children running wild because their mothers are too busy keeping everyone fed and clothed to properly educate them. You want work that matters? Come teach those kids." "I'm not a governess, Mr. Mercer." "No, ma'am. You're a noblewoman with what sounds like a fine education. Those children, they're hungry for more than just food. They're smart, restless, and headed for trouble if someone doesn't give them something to aim at beyond survival." He paused. "Ranch owner's daughter, Grace Holloway. She's been trying to teach them herself, but she's got the ranch accounts to manage now that her father's health is failing. She asked me to find someone in town who might help. I was planning to post a notice at the general store when I heard you and Caldwell." Arabella studied him carefully. "And what makes you think I'd be suitable?" "Because 15 minutes ago, I heard you tell one of the richest men in the territory that you'd rather have integrity than security. That tells me more about your character than any reference letter." He gestured toward the envelope in her hands. "Caldwell gave you enough to run. Question is whether you want to." She should say no. The sensible thing would be to return to San Francisco, book passage back to England, and live out her remaining years in quiet obscurity. Except that reinvention was a young woman's game. But the thought of that future, safe, small, silent, made something in her chest constrict with panic. What would the position entail, she heard herself ask. Room and board at the ranch, no salary to speak of, but you'd have your own cabin. Teach the children reading, writing, arithmetic, whatever you think they need to know. Grace would probably cry with relief if you'd also teach them some manners and maybe a bit of history. Mercer's mouth quirked slightly. "We're short on refinement out here." "I'm not certain refinement is what the frontier needs, Mr. Mercer." "Maybe not. But knowledge, purpose, those translate anywhere." He held out his hand. "What do you say, Lady Whitcroft? Want to do something that matters, or would you rather go back to being decorative?" Arabella looked at his outstretched hand. Work roughened, honest, extended without condescension. Behind her, Caldwell's house stood silent. Ahead, the desert stretched endlessly, harsh and indifferent. She'd spent 3 decades being what others wanted. Being quiet, ornamental, carefully restrained. And where had it gotten her? Standing in the dust of a nowhere town, rejected for the crime of possessing a mind. She reached out and shook Daniel Mercer's hand. His grip was firm, respectful. "When do we leave?" she asked. The ride to Red Mesa Ranch took 3 hours. the sun sinking slowly toward the horizon and painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. Arabella had insisted on riding rather than taking a wagon. She'd been an accomplished rider in her youth, and damned if she'd arrive at her new life like baggage being delivered. Mercer had raised an eyebrow but said nothing, simply helping her adjust the stirrups on a gentle mare named Sadie. Now they rode in comfortable silence, the only sounds the rhythmic creak of leather and the occasional call of a hawk overhead. "You handled that well," Mercer said eventually. "The horse, I mean. Most city folk need an hour to remember how." "I'm not most city folk, Mr. Mercer." Arabella adjusted her grip on the reins. "I grew up on an estate in Yorkshire. I could ride before I could properly read." "But you learned to read eventually." "Eventually," she smiled slightly. "My governess believed that an educated woman was a dangerous woman. She was right, though not in the way she intended." Mercer glanced at her. "What made you answer Caldwell's advertisement? A woman like you, educated, refined, clearly not desperate. Why risk coming all the way out here?" Arabella was quiet for a long moment, watching the landscape roll past. How to explain the suffocation of her previous life? The soul-crushing routine of managing a household she didn't care about, hosting dinners for people she didn't like, pretending her husband's intellectual mediocrity was actually wisdom? "I was dying," she said finally. "Not physically, but everything that made me myself was being slowly erased. My husband, Edward, he was a good man in his way, provided well, never raised a hand to me. But he wanted a wife who reflected his status, not one who challenged his thinking. For 30 years I performed that role. And when he died," she paused, "I realized I'd buried my own self long before I buried him." "So you decided to resurrect her?" "Something like that." Arabella looked at him directly. "Though I'm beginning to suspect resurrection requires more than just running away." "You're not running," Mercer's voice was certain. "Running is when you flee toward nothing. You're walking toward something. There's a difference." They crested a low hill, and Arabella saw it. Red Mesa Ranch spread across a valley. The buildings clustered around a main house that looked more substantial than she'd expected. Corrals held horses, and in the distance she could see cattle dotting the grassland. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and the sound of voices drifted up on the evening breeze. It looked alive, purposeful, real in a way her London townhouse had never been. "That's home," Mercer said simply. As they descended the hill, a woman emerged from the main house, tall, perhaps 30, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and the kind of confident stride that suggested she knew exactly who she was and made no apologies for it. She raised a hand in greeting. "That's Grace Holloway," Mercer explained, "ranch owner's daughter. She runs most of the daily operations now." Grace met them at the stable, her smile warm but assessing. "You must be Lady Whitcroft. Daniel said he might have found us a teacher, but I hardly dared hope. Welcome to Red Mesa. Please call me Arabella, and thank you for having me." She dismounted with only slightly less grace than she'd have liked, her muscles protesting the long ride. Grace's eyes were kind but sharp. "Daniel tells me you're educated. What can you teach?" "Reading, writing, mathematics, history, literature, basic Latin and French, rhetoric, and philosophy." Arabella met her gaze steadily. "I can also teach manners, though I suspect that's less useful here than practical knowledge." "Don't underestimate manners," Grace said dryly. "Teaching these children not to eat with their hands would be a considerable achievement." She gestured toward a small cabin set apart from the main buildings. "That'll be yours. It's simple, but it's private. Meals are in the main house, breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, supper at 7. The children gather in the barn loft in the mornings. It's the only space large enough, and at least it's dry." "How many children?" 7, ranging from 5 to 13. Fair warning, they're half wild and completely undisciplined. Their parents are good people, but they're working from sunrise to sunset. The kids have been raising themselves mostly. Grace's expression sobered. "If you can give them even a fraction of what you clearly had, you'll be changing their lives." Arabella felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest, not anxiety, but anticipation. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow, if you're willing." Grace handed her a key. "Get settled tonight. I'll have someone bring you dinner. And Arabella, thank you. We need this more than you probably realize." The cabin was indeed simple, One room with a bed, a small table, a chair, and a pot-bellied stove. A basin and pitcher sat on a stand near the window, but it was clean, and through the window Arabella could see the vast expanse of desert stretching toward mountains in the distance. It was hers, small and rough, but entirely hers. She unpacked her single trunk methodically, hanging the few dresses she'd brought on pegs along the wall. Most of her belongings had been sold to fund the journey. What remained was practical: books, writing supplies, a few personal items that couldn't be assigned monetary value. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find a young woman, 18 or 19, holding a covered plate. "Ma'am, I'm Sarah. Grace sent me with your supper." The girl had blonde hair and worried eyes, and she kept glancing at Arabella with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. "Thank you, Sarah." Arabella took the plate. "That's very kind." Sarah didn't leave. Instead, she twisted her hands together nervously. "Is it true you're a real lady? Like, from England?" "I was born in England, yes, though I'm not certain what makes one a real lady versus any other kind. My ma says ladies know how to talk proper, how to make people listen without raising their voices." Sarah's expression was painfully earnest. Could you maybe teach me that? I got a little girl, Emily. She's 5. I want her to have more than I did, but I don't know how to give it to her." Arabella felt something crack open in her chest. This girl, barely more than a child herself, already thinking about her daughter's future, already knowing that knowledge was the key to something better. "Sarah, tomorrow morning I'll be teaching the ranch children. I would be honored if you'd attend as well. And Emily, of course." Sarah's face lit up. "Really? You wouldn't mind?" "Mind? I'd welcome it," Arabella smiled. "Anyone who wants to learn is welcome in my classroom. Age is irrelevant." After Sarah left, Arabella sat at the small table and ate her supper: stew, fresh bread, and water that tasted faintly of minerals. It was simple, hearty, and honest. Nothing like the elaborate meals she'd endured in London, each course a performance of wealth and status. She opened one of her books, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, worn soft from years of secret reading. Edward had called philosophy unbecoming in a woman. She'd read it anyway, late at night, by candlelight. The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it. Arabella closed the book and looked out the window at the darkening desert. Somewhere in the main house, Grace Holloway was probably managing accounts and planning tomorrow's work. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, Daniel Mercer was likely settling in for the night, his quiet kindness already reshaping her understanding of what men could be. And somewhere in the small cabins scattered across the ranch, children were falling asleep. Children who would wake tomorrow to find that education wasn't a privilege reserved for the wealthy. It was their right, and she would give it to them with everything she had. For the first time in decades, Arabella Whitcroft felt purpose settle into her bones like warmth returning to frozen limbs. She was 52 years old, cast aside, dismissed, rejected, and she was finally free. Morning came early at Red Mesa Ranch. Arabella woke to the sound of roosters and the low murmur of voices as the ranch hands began their day. She dressed carefully in her plainest dress, dark blue cotton that had seen better days but was still respectable, and pinned her graying hair into a simple bun. The barn loft was already occupied when she arrived, climbing the ladder with more difficulty than she'd have liked. 7 children sat on hay bales, watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Sarah sat in the back, Emily on her lap. Arabella surveyed her students. The oldest was a boy of about 13, all gangly limbs and defensive posture. The youngest was a 5-year-old girl with tangled dark hair and suspicious eyes. The others fell somewhere in between, a spectrum of scrubbed faces and worn clothes, children who'd clearly been told to behave but weren't entirely sure why they should. "Good morning," Arabella said. "My name is Arabella Whitcroft. You may call me Miss Arabella." "Why can't we call you Lady?" the 13-year-old asked. His tone was challenging. "Sarah says you're a real lady from England." "Because Miss suggests someone who works for a living. Lady suggests someone who sits around being decorative. Which do you think I am?" The boy blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. A girl of about 9 giggled. "Now then," Arabella clasped her hands. "I understand none of you have had formal education. Is that correct?" Silence. Then the 9-year-old raised her hand tentatively. My ma taught me letters. I can read some. Excellent. What's your name? Clara. Well, Clara, you'll be helping me teach the others their letters. Everyone here has knowledge. We're going to pool it. Arabella looked at each child in turn. I'm not here to pour information into empty vessels. I'm here to help you learn to think, to question, to understand the world and your place in it. Does that interest you? The youngest girl, Emily, piped up in a clear voice. Why? Why what, dear? Why should we learn if we're just going to grow up and work the ranch anyway? Arabella knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with the child. Because knowing how to think means you get to choose your life instead of having it chosen for you. It means when someone tells you that you can't do something because you're too young or too poor or the wrong gender, you'll have the tools to prove them wrong. Does that answer your question? Emily considered this seriously, then nodded. Arabella stood. Now, let's begin with something practical. Who here knows what the stars are? Lights in the sky, the 13-year-old said. Yes, but what kind of lights? And why do they move? And how did ancient people use them to navigate? For the next 3 hours, Arabella taught. Not by lecturing, but by asking questions, encouraging debate, making them think. She taught them about astronomy through the lens of navigation, about mathematics through the practical problems of measuring land and managing resources, about history through the stories of people who'd changed the world despite impossible odds. And slowly, grudgingly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm, the children engaged. When she finally dismissed them for the midday meal, they scattered like released birds, all except the 13-year-old who lingered. Yeah, Thomas. I'm sorry I was rude earlier about the lady thing. You weren't rude. You were testing me. That's smart. Arabella gathered her few supplies. Don't apologize for being smart, Thomas. Just use it well. Miss Arabella. He scuffed his boot against the floor. You really think people like us can change things, even though we're just ranch kids? She looked at him. This boy on the cusp of manhood, already learning that the world might not make space for him. Thomas, do you know what I was before I came here? A lady in England? I was a decoration. A pretty, educated decoration whose only value was in making her husband look good. I spent 30 years being told that my worth was in being quiet and agreeable. She met his eyes. I'm 52 years old, and this is the first time in my life I've been allowed to be useful. So yes, I believe people like us can change things. Because if I can start over at my age, you can accomplish anything at yours. Thomas straightened slightly, something shifting in his expression. I want to learn everything you can teach me. Then show up tomorrow ready to work. Knowledge isn't given, Thomas. It's earned. That evening, after supper, Arabella found Daniel Mercer sitting on the porch of the main house, a book in his lap. She hesitated, then approached. May I join you? He glanced up, surprised but pleased. Of course. How was your first day? Exhausting, exhilarating, terrifying. She sank into the chair beside him with a sigh. Those children are sharper than half the adults I knew in London. They've had to be. Life out here doesn't tolerate stupidity long. He closed his book. She glimpsed the title, On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. Grace said you had them debating the ethics of land ownership by the end of the morning session. They needed to understand that property isn't just about possession. It's about responsibility. Arabella looked out at the darkening landscape. Though I may have gotten carried away. Getting carried away is better than not caring at all. Mercer set the book aside. Lady Whitcroft. Arabella. Please. Arabella, then. I wanted to ask you something, and I'll understand if the answer is no. She turned to him, curious. Go on. Would you be willing to teach me as well? I can read, write, do numbers, but I never had formal education. There are things I want to understand, philosophy, history, how to make arguments that actually convince people. I'm 43 years old, and I figure if you can start over at 52, I can damn well learn something new at 43. Arabella felt a smile tug at her lips. You're quoting me to myself, Mr. Mercer. Daniel, and yes, I am. Is it working? Shameless flattery often does. She considered him, this quiet, thoughtful man who'd given her a second chance without hesitation. I'll teach you on one condition. Name it. You teach me in return. About this place, this life. how to survive here, how to understand the people. I may know philosophy, Daniel, but I don't know the first thing about the frontier. That makes you the expert. He extended his hand. Deal. She shook it and felt something shift, a connection forming, built not on romance or attraction, but on mutual respect and the shared hunger to become more than they were. We start tomorrow evening, she said, after I've finished with the children. I'll bring coffee and questions. As Arabella walked back to her cabin that night, the desert air cool against her skin, she thought about the different kinds of beginnings. Some began with trumpets and celebration. Others began quietly, with a handshake and a shared commitment to growth. She thought of Victor Caldwell's dismissal, too educated, too opinionated, too old, and felt a fierce satisfaction. Let him have his ornamental wife. She had something infinitely more valuable. She had purpose. She had students hungry for knowledge. She had a partnership forming with a man who valued her mind as much as any other quality. And she had time. Not endless time, but enough. Enough to prove that reinvention wasn't reserved for the young. Enough to show these frontier children that their lives could be more than simple survival. Enough to finally become the woman she'd always been beneath the layers of expectation and restraint. Arabella Whitcroft stood at the threshold of her small cabin and looked back at Red Mesa Ranch. Lamplight glowed in windows. Voices drifted on the evening air. Somewhere, Thomas was probably lying in his bunk, thinking about tomorrow's lesson. Somewhere, Sarah was tucking Emily into bed, dreaming of a future where her daughter had choices. And here, in this harsh and unforgiving land, a 52-year-old woman who'd been cast aside as too much of everything had finally found a place where too much was exactly enough. She stepped inside, lit her lamp, and opened her notebook. Tomorrow's lesson needed planning. There was so much to teach, so much to learn, so much life left to live. The rejection that had felt like an ending was actually a door opening. And Arabella Whitcroft walked through it without looking back. 3 weeks into her tenure at Red Mesa Ranch, Arabella discovered that teaching children who'd spent their lives half wild required more than pedagogical expertise. It required patience she hadn't known she possessed, creativity born of desperation, and a willingness to admit when her methods failed spectacularly. The morning started badly when she found Thomas and 2 other boys, Jacob and Peter, fighting in the barn loft, hay scattered everywhere, noses bloodied, and absolutely no remorse on any of their faces. Enough! Arabella's voice cracked through the chaos like a whip. The boys froze mid-swing. All 3 of you, sit down, now! They sat, sullen and defiant. The other children watched with wide eyes from their hay bales, Clara clutching her primer like a shield. What, Arabella said, her voice dangerously quiet, could possibly be worth disrupting everyone's education? He said my ma can't read because she's stupid, Thomas spat, glaring at Jacob. Nobody talks about my ma like that. I didn't say stupid, Jacob protested, wiping blood from his lip. I said ignorant. There's a difference. And you think that's better? Peter chimed in. That's worse. Stupid means you can't help it. Ignorant means you're too lazy to learn. Arabella held up a hand. Jacob, stand up. The boy stood warily, perhaps 12 years old, with the kind of sharp features that suggested he'd grow into a handsome man if life didn't beat it out of him first. Define ignorant for me, she said. It means not knowing things. Correct. Now, does your mother know how to birth a calf in breech position? Jacob blinked. Yes, ma'am. She's done it dozens of times. Can she identify which plants are poisonous and which are medicinal? Of course. Can she manage a household budget, preserve food for winter, treat infection, and keep 4 children alive in one of the harshest environments on Earth? Yes, but then she possesses considerable knowledge. She simply doesn't possess the same knowledge as someone who can read. That doesn't make her ignorant, Jacob. It makes her differently educated. Arabella looked at each boy in turn. Every person in this ranch knows things the rest of us don't. Your mothers know survival. I know books. Daniel knows horses and land management. Grace knows business. We are all ignorant in different ways, which is why we need each other. Thomas's shoulders had relaxed slightly, though his jaw was still set. He still shouldn't have said it. No, he shouldn't have. Jacob, apologize. I'm sorry, Thomas. I didn't mean it how it sounded. Thomas, Accept the apology or explain why you can't. Thomas struggled with himself for a moment, then muttered, I accept it. Good. Now all three of you will spend the morning copying out Marcus Aurelius. Whenever you are about to find fault with someone, ask yourself the following question. What fault of mine most nearly resembles the one I am about to criticize? 100 times, in your best handwriting. She gestured to the corner. Begin. The boys groaned but moved to comply. Arabella turned to the rest of the class, who were watching her with a mixture of awe and terror. Let that be a lesson, she said calmly. Words have power. Use them carefully, or you'll spend your morning copying philosophy until your hand cramps. Now, where were we? Ah, yes, Clara was going to tell us about the water cycle. Well, later, during the midday break, Grace found Arabella sitting outside the barn, her head in her hands. Heard there was an incident, Grace said, settling onto the bench beside her. They were fighting, over words. Arabella looked up. In London, boys fought over honor and perceived slights. Here, they fight because someone suggested their mother is uneducated. I'm not certain which is more absurd. Neither is absurd when you're protecting what matters. Grace handed her a canteen of water. Thomas's father ran off when he was 6. His mother, Margaret, raised him and his 2 sisters alone. She works in our kitchen now, but for years they barely survived. Thomas is fierce about protecting her because she's all he has. Arabella drank, the water cool and mineral sharp. I grew up believing education was about refinement. Proper speech, classical languages, the ability to navigate a dinner party without embarrassing oneself. Out here, it means something entirely different, doesn't it? Out here, education means understanding why the cattle cluster before a storm, or which direction to dig a well, or how to read a contract so some banker doesn't steal your land. Grace's expression was serious. But what you're teaching them? How to think, how to argue without fists, how to see beyond their immediate circumstances. That's just as vital, maybe more so. I'm not certain I'm qualified for this, Grace. Nobody is. That's what makes it worth doing. Grace stood, brushing dust from her skirt. By the way, Daniel asked me to tell you he can't make your evening lesson tonight. He and the men are moving cattle to the north pasture. Should be back tomorrow. Arabella felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. Over the past 3 weeks, those evening sessions with Daniel had become the part of her day she most looked forward to. They'd progressed through basic philosophy into more complex discussions. The nature of property, the ethics of frontier expansion, the tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility. But more than the intellectual stimulation, she valued the way he listened. Really listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak. He asked questions that forced her to clarify her thinking, challenged assumptions without condescension, and shared his own insights with a humility that somehow made them more persuasive. Tell him I'll expect a full report on cattle psychology when he returns, she said lightly. Grace smiled. I'll pass that along. That evening, alone in her cabin with only lamplight and her thoughts, Arabella found herself restless. She tried reading Plato's Republic, which she'd planned to discuss with Daniel, but couldn't concentrate. Finally, she pulled out her journal and began to write. I have been here less than a month, yet already I feel more myself than I did in 3 decades of marriage. Is that terrible to admit? Edward was not cruel. He provided well, maintained appearances, fulfilled his duties as a husband, but he never once asked what I thought about anything that mattered. Our conversations were performances, each playing our assigned role. Here, the children ask me questions I don't know how to answer. Why do rich people get to decide what's fair? If everyone's equal, why do some people get land and others don't? What makes something true if different people believe different things? And Daniel, he asks different questions entirely. What do you actually believe, not what you were taught to believe? When did you first realize your life wasn't your own? What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? I'm 52 years old. I should know these answers by now. The fact that I don't should shame me. Instead, it exhilarates me. A knock interrupted her writing. She opened the door to find Sarah, Emily, asleep in her arms. I'm sorry to bother you, Miss Arabella, but could you— Sarah's voice cracked. Could you just talk to me about anything? My husband's been gone on a cattle drive for 2 weeks, and Emily's been fussy. And I I need to hear someone speak about something other than chores and weather. Arabella stepped back immediately. Come in. Put Emily on the bed. Sarah settled the child gently, then sank into the chair, her young face drawn with exhaustion. She couldn't have been more than 19, but she carried herself like someone decades older. Tell me what you're reading in the lessons, Arabella said, settling on the edge of the bed. Clara mentioned you finished the primer. I did. It's slow going, but I'm reading now. Real reading. Sarah's expression brightened slightly. Yesterday, I read a whole page from that book you lent me, the one about the French Revolution. What did you think? I think, Sarah hesitated, then pushed forward. I think those rich people got what they deserved. They kept all the bread while people starved, and then acted surprised when folks got angry enough to do something about it. That's certainly one interpretation. What else could explain their behavior? What do you mean? Well, do you think they were evil, or simply so removed from ordinary life that they genuinely couldn't understand the suffering they caused? Sarah frowned, considering. I guess, if you never have to worry about food, you might forget that other people do. That's almost worse than being evil, isn't it? Evil at least knows it's doing wrong. There's a philosopher named Hannah Arendt who would agree with you. She wrote about the banality of evil, the idea that great harm is often done by ordinary people who simply don't think about the consequences of their actions. Like the men who make laws about land without thinking about the families they're displacing, Sarah said slowly. Or the bankers who foreclose on ranches without considering where those people will go. Arabella felt a surge of satisfaction. Exactly. You're thinking like a scholar, Sarah. I'm just a ranch wife who can barely read. No, you're a woman who's learning to see systems instead of just individual actions. That's sophisticated thinking. Arabella leaned forward. Sarah, what do you want for Emily? Beyond basic literacy, beyond manners, what do you dream for her? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I want her to have choices. I got married at 16 because it was that or work in a saloon. I love my husband. I do. But I wish I'd had other options. I want Emily to be able to choose her life instead of just surviving it. Then we'll make sure she has the tools to choose. Education, confidence, the ability to argue her point and defend her rights. Arabella reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand, and you'll model it for her. Every time she sees you reading, thinking, questioning, you're showing her what's possible. They talked for another hour about books and ideas and the future. When Sarah finally left, Emily still sleeping peacefully, Arabella felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on her shoulders. These people weren't just students. They were betting their futures on the idea that knowledge could change their circumstances. She couldn't fail them. The next morning, Arabella woke before dawn with a new lesson plan burning in her mind. When the children assembled in the barn loft, she had them arrange the hay bales in a circle instead of rows. Today, she announced, we're going to discuss something dangerous. That got their attention. Thomas sat up straighter. Claire's eyes went wide. Even the youngest children leaned in. We're going to talk about whether the way things are is the way things should be, about who decides what's fair and whether ordinary people have the right to question those decisions. She looked at each face. This is dangerous because thinking for yourself always is. It means you might reach conclusions that make powerful people uncomfortable. Are you ready for that? Yes, Thomas said immediately. I think so, Clara added, less certain but game. Good. Let's start with a question. Why do men own land but women don't? Silence. Then Peter raised his hand tentatively. Because that's just how it is? That's an observation, not a reason. Try again. Because women can't work the land like men can? Jacob offered. Can't or aren't allowed to, Arabella countered. Sarah's mother runs 100 acres on her own since her husband died. Seems she can work land just fine. But the law says, Clara started, the law says many things. The question is whether the law is just. Remember what we read about unjust laws last week? What did Frederick Douglass say? Thomas's hand shot up. He said a law isn't right just because it's a law. People make laws, and people can be wrong. Exactly. So let's examine this law. If a woman can work land, manage money, raise children, and make sound decisions, why shouldn't she own property? Arabella let the question hang, because she might get married and then her husband would control it, one of the older girls said quietly. My ma had land before she married. My pa took it over. She wasn't happy about it. So the law assumes women are less capable, or that men have the right to control what women own. Is that fair? No, several voices said at once. All right, next question. What should you do when you recognize a law is unfair? This was the dangerous part. Arabella could see them processing, understanding that she was asking them to think beyond acceptance. You could break the law, Thomas said slowly, but then you'd be punished. Or you could try to change it, Clara added, like those suffragettes you told us about. Both valid responses. But there's a third option. You could work around it, find ways to exercise power even within unjust systems. Arabella stood. Grace Holloway doesn't technically own this ranch. Her father does. But she runs it. She makes the decisions, manages the accounts, hires the workers. The law says the property is her father's, but the reality is different. She's found power in the space between what's written and what's practiced. That's sneaky, Peter said, but he sounded admiring. No, it's strategic. When the system is rigged against you, you have to be smarter than the system. Arabella began walking around the circle. This is what I want you to understand. Everything about the way the world works was decided by people. Not fate, not nature, not divine will, people. Which means different people can decide differently. You can decide differently. But we're just kids, one of the younger boys protested. Now you are. But Thomas will be a man in a few years. Clara will be a woman. What kind of adults will you be? Ones who accept injustice because that's just how it is. Or ones who question, challenge, and change what's wrong. The discussion went on for 2 hours, ranging from property rights to labor conditions to the treatment of native populations. Arabella didn't push specific conclusions. She didn't have to. The children reached them on their own, their outrage and idealism combining into something fierce and beautiful. When Daniel returned that evening, dusty and exhausted, he found Arabella sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset. Grace said you wanted a report on cattle psychology, he said, settling into the chair beside her with a groan. I was being facetious, but now I'm curious. Cattle are stubborn, short-sighted, and prone to panic. Also, they hate change and will fight you every step of the way toward their own best interest. He accepted the coffee she poured him. How was teaching? I may have started a revolution. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That sounds like a story. She told him about the lesson, watching his expression shift from amusement to something more serious. You're teaching them to question authority, he said finally, to challenge the way things are. Yes. Is that a problem? Problem? No. Dangerous? Absolutely. He looked at her directly. Arabella, there are men in this territory who won't take kindly to children, especially ranch children, getting ideas about fairness and justice. You're teaching them to think like citizens, not subjects. That's threatening to people who profit from ignorance. Good. Daniel laughed, surprising both of them. You've been here less than a month and you're ready to overturn the social order. I've spent my entire life in a social order that had no place for me except as decoration. Forgive me if I'm not particularly invested in preserving it. She set down her cup. Besides, these children deserve better than accepting limitations that were placed on them by accident of birth. Agreed. I'm just warning you that not everyone will feel that way. He paused. There's talk in town about the English lady teaching radical ideas at Red Mesa. Caldwell's been drinking at the saloon, telling anyone who'll listen that you're unnatural, too educated for a woman, poisoning young minds. Arabella felt cold settle in her stomach, but she kept her voice steady. Let him talk. I'm not breaking any laws. Not yet, but be careful. Men like Caldwell, they don't like being proven wrong. And every day you succeed here, you prove he made a mistake in rejecting you. They sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of the situation settling around them. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice quieter. Teach me something. Something you think I need to know. Right now. Right now. I've spent 3 days thinking about cattle and dust. I need to remember there's more to life than survival. Arabella considered, then went into her cabin and returned with a book. John Stuart Mill, On Liberty. He argues that society has no right to force conformity on individuals unless their actions harm others. That tyranny of the majority is as dangerous as tyranny of a monarch. Sounds relevant. Read the first chapter tonight. Tomorrow we'll discuss it. I want to know what you think about his harm principle. The idea that the only legitimate reason to restrict someone's freedom is if they're hurting someone else. Daniel took the book carefully, as if it were something precious. Can I ask you something personal? You can ask. Why does this matter so much to you, teaching these specific children in this specific place? You could have stayed in England, found some comfortable position as a governess or companion. Why risk everything on a bunch of ranch kids in the middle of nowhere? Arabella looked out at the darkening landscape, choosing her words carefully. Because I spent 30 years being told my education was wasted on me, that my intelligence was unfeminine, my opinions unwelcome, my potential irrelevant. I was ornamental, Daniel. Beautiful, accomplished, completely useless. She turned to face him. These children will never be ornamental. They'll work with their hands, struggle for survival, face hardships I can barely imagine. But they don't have to be intellectually imprisoned. They don't have to accept limitations that someone else decided for them. If I can give them the tools to think, to question, to imagine something better, then maybe my education wasn't wasted after all. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. You're the least ornamental person I've ever met. Something warm unfurled in Arabella's chest. Not romance exactly, but recognition. Being seen, truly seen, for who she actually was rather than who someone wanted her to be. Thank you, she said simply. I'll read the chapter tonight. Fair warning, I'm going to have questions. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. After he left, Arabella remained on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere in town, Victor Caldwell was nursing his wounded pride and spreading poison about her. Somewhere in the territory, men were making decisions that would affect all their lives. Somewhere in the future, the children she taught today would face their own battles. But here, now, she had this. A small cabin, purposeful work, students who challenged her, and a man who valued her mind. It wasn't the life she'd imagined as a young woman in Yorkshire. It wasn't the life she'd endured as Lady Whitcroft in London. It was better. The next evening, Daniel arrived at her cabin with the book, 3 pages of notes, and the kind of intense expression that suggested he'd been arguing with Mill in his head all day. His harm principle is too simple, he said without preamble. It doesn't account for indirect harm or systemic oppression. Arabella grinned. Sit down and explain. Mill says you can do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting anyone else. But what about a banker who forecloses on a ranch legally? He's following the law, not directly harming anyone, but the family loses their home. Or a man who pays his workers barely enough to survive. He's not enslaving them, but he's benefiting from their poverty. That's harm, even if it's wrapped in contracts and property rights. So you're saying the harm principle needs to be expanded to include structural violence? I don't know what that means, but probably. Daniel flipped through his notes. Also, who decides what counts as harm? Mill acts like it's obvious, but it's not. Some people think teaching women to read is harmful because it makes them dissatisfied with their lives. Others think denying them education is harmful because it limits their potential. Same action, completely different moral judgments. Arabella felt genuine delight. You've identified exactly the weakness in Mill's argument. He assumes a shared understanding of harm that doesn't exist. Different communities, different moral frameworks, different conclusions about what society can legitimately prohibit. So what's the answer? I don't know. That's what makes it philosophy instead of instruction manual. She leaned forward. But here's what I think. The harm principle fails when it's applied mechanically. You need judgment, context, the ability to see beyond individual transactions to larger patterns, which requires exactly the kind of education we're trying to provide. They talked until midnight, ranging through philosophy, politics, personal experience. Daniel shared stories from his years working ranches across the West, observations about power and survival that grounded abstract principles in concrete reality. Arabella contributed theoretical frameworks and historical examples, showing how the patterns he'd observed connected to larger systems. It was the most intellectually stimulating conversation she'd had in years, possibly ever. When Daniel finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. Can I tell you something? And you won't think I'm being forward? That depends on what it is. I've worked for 3 different ranch owners in my life. 2 of them treated me like a slightly more useful piece of equipment than their horses. Grace's father, John Holloway, he was different. He asked what I thought, listened when I spoke, promoted me based on competence instead of connections. He treated me like I mattered. Daniel met her eyes. You do the same thing, not just with me, with everyone. The children, Sarah, the ranch hands. You make people feel like their thoughts have value. That's rare, Arabella. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise. He left before she could respond, but his words settled into her bones like warmth. The following week brought the first real test of Arabella's methods. A man arrived at the ranch, portly, overdressed for the frontier, sweating profusely in the afternoon heat. He introduced himself as Harrison Webb, a representative from the Territorial Education Board. I've received complaints, Webb said, sitting in Grace's office while Arabella stood, refusing to sit when she felt like prey. About irregular educational practices at this ranch, specifically that you're teaching children to question legitimate authority and reject traditional values. I'm teaching them to think, Arabella said calmly. If that results in questioning, perhaps the authority being questioned should examine why it can't withstand scrutiny. Webb's face reddened. Mrs. Whitcroft. Lady Whitcroft, if we're using titles. Lady Whitcroft, there are standards for frontier education. Basic literacy, arithmetic, practical skills. You're teaching philosophy, political theory, encouraging children to challenge their parents and society. I'm teaching them that their minds are their own, that they have the right to form opinions based on evidence and logic rather than simply accepting what they're told. Arabella crossed her arms. If that frightens you, Mr. Webb, I'd suggest examining why. It's inappropriate. These are ranch children, not future scholars. They need to learn their place. Their place? Arabella's voice went cold. And what place would that be exactly? Subservient? Ignorant? Grateful for whatever scraps of knowledge their betters choose to provide? Grace, who'd been watching silently, finally spoke. Mr. Webb, these children's test scores have improved dramatically in the past month. They can read, write, calculate, and express themselves clearly. If the Education Board has a problem with that, I'd like to hear the pedagogical basis for your objection. Webb sputtered. It's not about scores, Miss Holloway. It's about proper values. Whose values? Arabella interrupted. Yours? Mr. Caldwell's? The men who benefit from keeping ranch families just educated enough to work, but not educated enough to question wages or working conditions? That's slander. No, that's economics. And if you think teaching children to understand economics is inappropriate, I'd suggest you're proving my point about who benefits from ignorance. The interview ended badly, with Webb threatening to recommend the ranch's educational program be shut down. After he left, Grace poured them both whiskey, despite the early hour, and they sat in heavy silence. I'm sorry, Arabella said finally. I may have just destroyed everything. No, you said what needed saying. Grace swirled her whiskey. But he's right about one thing. You're threatening people. Every child you teach to think is a future adult who won't accept exploitation quietly. That terrifies men like Webb and Caldwell. So what do? We keep going. We document everything, lesson plans, test scores, student progress. We build a case that what you're doing works, and we prepare for a fight. Grace looked at her directly. Are you ready for that? Because it's coming. Arabella thought of the children, of Sarah reading about the French Revolution, of Thomas defending his mother's dignity, of Daniel filling notebooks with questions about justice and freedom. Yes, she said. I'm ready. That night, she wrote in her journal again. They want me to teach compliance disguised as education, to give these children just enough knowledge to be useful without giving them enough to be dangerous. But knowledge cannot be measured out in safe doses. Once you teach someone to think, you cannot control what they think about. I'm 52 years old. I have no children of my own, no legacy beyond what I build here. If I'm going to fight, and it seems I am, I'd rather fight for something that matters. Let them come. The fight came sooner than expected. 2 weeks after Webb's visit, an official-looking envelope arrived at Red Mesa Ranch, delivered by a nervous young courier who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Grace opened it in her office with Arabella standing beside her, both of them silent as they read the typed notice. The Territorial Education Board had issued a formal cease order. Effective immediately, all educational activities at Red Mesa Ranch were to be suspended pending a full review of curriculum, teaching methods, and materials. Any violation would result in fines and potential criminal charges for operating an unlicensed educational institution. "They can't do this," Arabella said, but her voice lacked conviction. "They just did." Grace set the letter down carefully, as if it might explode. It's signed by 3 board members, including Webb. They're claiming we're operating outside territorial guidelines. "We're teaching children to read. We're teaching them to think. That's the problem." Grace moved to the window, her jaw tight. "My father warned me about this years ago. He said the territory doesn't want educated ranch families because educated people demand fair wages, safe conditions, and the right to organize. They want workers, not citizens." Arabella felt something hot and furious rising in her chest. "What are you going to do?" "Fight. But it'll take time. Lawyers, appeals, documentation. Weeks, maybe months." Grace turned back. "I'm sorry, Arabella. You came here to teach, and I'm failing you." "You're not failing anyone. They're trying to silence us, which means we're doing something that matters." Arabella began pacing, her mind racing. There has to be a way around this, some legal loophole, A knock interrupted her. Daniel stood in the doorway, his expression grim. "Town meeting tonight at the saloon. Word is Caldwell's organizing ranchers to support the cease order. He's arguing that radical education threatens the stability of frontier families." Daniel's eyes met Arabella's. "He's making you the villain." "Of course he is." Arabella felt exhausted suddenly, the weight of it all pressing down. "I should have known this was coming." "We all should have," Grace said, "but knowing doesn't make it easier." She straightened her shoulders. "Daniel, saddle 3 horses. We're going to that meeting." "Grace, that's not wise," Daniel started. "I don't care about wise. I care about right. They're attacking my ranch, my decisions, and my teacher. I'm not letting them do it unopposed." Arabella touched Grace's arm. "You don't have to defend me. I knew this position was temporary." "The hell I don't." Grace's voice was steel. "You've transformed those children in 6 weeks. Thomas is reading philosophy. Claire's doing mathematics 2 years above her age level. Sarah's learning to think critically about systems of power. You've given them tools they'll use for the rest of their lives. I'm not letting some small-minded bureaucrats destroy that because it makes them uncomfortable." Daniel looked between them, then nodded slowly. "I'll get the horses ready. But Arabella, you should prepare yourself. This won't be pleasant." The saloon in Copper Springs was packed when they arrived, the air thick with tobacco smoke and testosterone. Arabella felt every eye turned to her as she walked in, Grace on one side and Daniel on the other. The conversations didn't stop exactly, but they shifted, became pointed. Victor Caldwell stood near the bar, surrounded by men Arabella didn't recognize. He saw her and something ugly flickered across his face. Not quite triumph, but close. "Gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying easily. "How gracious of Red Mesa to join us, though I'm surprised Lady Whitcroft had the nerve to show her face after corrupting our children." "I've corrupted no one," Arabella said, her voice calm despite the rage simmering beneath her skin. "I've taught them to read, write, and think. If you consider that corruption, Mr. Caldwell, that says more about you than it does about me. You've taught them to question their parents, reject tradition, and believe themselves above their station." Caldwell gestured to the room. "These are ranch families, ma'am. They need children who understand hard work and respect, not philosophy and revolution." "And you've decided this on their behalf?" Grace cut in. "Without asking what those families actually want for their children? I know what's best for this community. I've built half the businesses in this town." "With money inherited from your father," Daniel said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. He rarely spoke in public settings, which made his words carry more weight. "You didn't build anything, Caldwell. You inherited capital and hired people to build for you. Don't mistake wealth for wisdom." Caldwell's face went red. "How dare you? How dare I speak truth?" Daniel stepped forward, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard. "You rejected Lady Whitcroft because she was too educated, too opinionated, too unwilling to submit. Then she went to Red Mesa and proved you wrong by doing exactly what you claimed she couldn't, making a real difference. This isn't about protecting children, Caldwell. This is about your wounded pride. This is about maintaining order. Caldwell slammed his hand on the bar. That woman is teaching children, to reject legitimate authority. She's filling their heads with dangerous ideas about equality and justice and questioning the natural order of things. The natural order. Arabella's voice cut through the noise like a blade. And what natural order would that be, Mr. Caldwell? The one where women are property? Where children work themselves to death in factories? Where native populations are slaughtered for land? Because I've studied history, sir, and every atrocity ever committed has been justified by someone claiming it was the natural order. Silence fell. Several men looked uncomfortable. Others looked angry. Caldwell looked apoplectic. You see? He gestured wildly at Arabella. This is exactly what I'm talking about. She's unnatural. No proper woman speaks like that, thinks like that. No proper woman according to whom? Sarah's voice came from the back of the room. Arabella turned, shocked to see the young mother standing there with several other women from the ranch. Margaret, Thomas's mother. Eleanor, who worked in the laundry, and 4 others. According to you? According to men who benefit from keeping us ignorant? Sarah, this doesn't concern you, one of the men started. It absolutely concerns me. Sarah moved forward, and Arabella could see her hands trembling, but her voice stayed steady. Miss Arabella taught me to read. Real reading, not just picking out words. She taught me about history and politics and philosophy. She taught me that my thoughts matter, that I have a right to question things that don't make sense. And you want to take that away because it threatens you. We want to protect traditional values, Webb said, appearing from the crowd. The family structure, proper roles, traditional values. Margaret's voice was bitter. My husband abandoned me and our 3 children 8 years ago. Those traditional values you're so keen on protecting didn't put food on my table or clothes on my babies' backs. I did that. Me, working my hands to the bone. And now my son can read and write and think because of Lady Whitcroft. And you want to stop that because it's not traditional enough? Ladies, please, Caldwell tried to regain control. Don't you ladies please us, Eleanor snapped. She was older, maybe 45, with the weathered face of someone who'd worked outdoors her entire life. You men sit here drinking and deciding what's best for our children without asking us what we think. Well, I'm telling you what I think. Miss Arabella is the best thing that's happened to this community. And if you shut her down, you're proving you care more about control than you do about our kids' futures. A rancher Arabella didn't recognize stood up. Now hold on. This isn't about control. It's about maintaining standards. The Education Board has guidelines written by men who've never set foot in a frontier school, Grace interrupted. Guidelines designed for urban centers with resources we don't have. Lady Whitcroft has improved test scores, attendance, and engagement in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. What exactly is your objection to that? The objection is to the content, Webb said. Teaching children about revolution, about questioning authority, about systems of oppression, that's not appropriate for children. Why not? Thomas's voice came from near the door. Arabella's heart sank. The children weren't supposed to be here. But Thomas stood there with Clara beside him, both of them looking terrified but determined. Why isn't it appropriate to teach us the truth? Thomas, go home, Margaret started. No, Ma, I want to say this. Thomas looked around the room. Before Miss Arabella came, I could barely read. I knew how to work cattle and fix fences and nothing else. I figured that's all I'd ever do. But she taught me that I could be more than that. That I could think, understand things, maybe even change things someday. And you want to take that away because it scares you. Boy, you don't understand what you're talking about, Caldwell said dismissively. I understand that you rejected Miss Arabella because she was too smart, because she wouldn't pretend to be stupid to make you comfortable. Thomas's voice shook, but he pushed on. And now you're trying to stop her from teaching us because you're afraid we'll turn out like her. People who won't accept things just because you say so. Clara stepped forward. Miss Arabella taught us that we have worth, that our minds matter, that we don't have to accept limitations other people put on us. If that's dangerous, then I want to be dangerous. The room erupted in competing voices, some supporting the children, others demanding they be removed, still others arguing about education and authority and tradition. Through it all, Arabella stood frozen, watching these children risk themselves to defend her. Daniel's hand found hers, squeezed once, a silent acknowledgement of what they were witnessing. Finally, a man Arabella hadn't noticed before stood up. He was older, maybe 60, with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone fall silent without him raising his voice. "I'm Judge Aldrich," he said. "I've been listening to this debate with interest, and I have a question for Mr. Webb." He turned to the Education Board representative. "You claim Lady Whitcroft's teaching methods violate territorial guidelines. Which specific guideline?" Webb sputtered. The standards for appropriate content. Which standard specifically? Quote it for me." "I don't have the document with me, but..." "Convenient. Because I do have the territorial education statutes with me, and I've reviewed them carefully. There is nothing in them that prohibits teaching philosophy, political theory, or critical thinking. In fact, the statutes explicitly encourage the development of reasoning faculties and civic understanding." Aldrich pulled out a document. "Section 12, paragraph 3. Would you like me to read it aloud?" Webb's face went pale. "The spirit of the law The spirit of the law cannot be used to enforce restrictions the actual law doesn't contain. That's tyranny, Mr. Webb, not governance." Aldrich looked around the room. "I've also reviewed the test scores from Red Mesa Ranch. They're exemplary. So unless someone can provide actual legal grounds for this cease order, not moral objections, not personal grievances, but legal grounds, I'm prepared to rule it invalid." "You can't do that," Caldwell protested. "You're just one judge. I'm the territorial circuit judge, which means my rulings stand unless overturned by a higher court. Would you like to appeal?" Aldrich's expression made it clear what he thought of that option. "Because I'd be happy to put this on the record. How the Education Board attempted to shut down a successful program because it made certain men uncomfortable." The silence that followed was thick and ugly. Caldwell looked like he wanted to murder someone. Webb looked like he wanted to disappear. The other ranchers looked mostly confused, uncertain which way to lean. Then Sarah spoke again. "I just want to say one more thing. You men are arguing about what's proper and natural and traditional. But you know what's not natural? Women dying in childbirth because nobody taught them basic hygiene. Children working 14-hour days because their parents can't read contracts. Families losing their land because they didn't understand the law. Miss Arabella is teaching us how to survive in a world that's designed to exploit us. If you can't see the value in that, then you're the ones who are dangerous, not her." Margaret nodded. "My son defends me with words now instead of fists. He reads every night by lamplight, hungry for knowledge the way he used to be hungry for food. You want to take that away from him, from all our children, because it threatens your idea of how things should be. Well, I say your idea is wrong." One by one, the women from Red Mesa spoke, testifying to improved literacy, to children who asked questions and thought critically, to a future that looked different from the past. And slowly, gradually, some of the men began to shift. Not all of them. Caldwell and his closest supporters remained stone-faced, but enough. Judge Aldrich stood again. "I'm issuing a temporary injunction against the cease order. Red Mesa Ranch may continue its educational activities pending a full hearing, which I'll schedule for 6 weeks from now. That gives everyone time to gather evidence, prepare arguments, and determine whether there are actual legal violations or just hurt feelings." He looked at Caldwell. "In the meantime, I suggest you focus on your own affairs, Mr. Caldwell, and let other people focus on theirs." The meeting dissolved after that, people filtering out in clumps of conversation. Arabella found herself surrounded by the women from the ranch, their faces fierce and proud. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, we did," Sarah said simply. "You gave us voices. We're not going to be silent just because men find it inconvenient." Outside, the cool night air was a relief after the stifling saloon. Daniel walked beside Arabella in silence for a while before speaking. "That was remarkable," he said quietly. "What those women did, what the children did." "That was terrifying," Arabella corrected. "They put themselves at risk. They stood up for what matters. You taught them that." He stopped, turned to face her. "Do you understand what you've done here? You've given people power they didn't know they had. That's dangerous, yes, but it's also the most important thing anyone can do." Arabella looked back at the saloon, where lamplight spilled onto the dusty street. "I'm not sure I can live up to what they think I am." "You already have." Daniel's voice was certain. You just need to believe it. The ride back to Red Mesa was quiet, each of them lost in thought. When they arrived, Grace headed straight to her office to document everything that had happened. Daniel went to check on the horses, and Arabella returned to her cabin exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. But sleep wouldn't come. She lit her lamp and pulled out her journal, needing to process the night's events. They defended me. Not just Grace or Daniel, but Sarah and Margaret and Eleanor, women who have every reason to stay silent, to protect themselves, to avoid conflict. And the children, Thomas and Clara, standing in a room full of adults, speaking truth to power. I came here thinking I would save them through education. But they're the ones saving me, reminding me that courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about being terrified and speaking anyway. Caldwell wants to destroy me because I refuse to be what he wanted. Webb wants to silence me because I threaten the comfortable order of things. But those women and children, they want me to keep going because I've shown them what's possible. How can I do anything but continue? A knock startled her. She opened the door to find Grace, still in her dusty riding clothes, holding 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey. "Thought you might need this," Grace said. They sat at Arabella's small table, glasses poured, comfortable silence settling between them. "Thank you," Grace said finally, "for not backing down in there, for standing your ground. I didn't have much choice. They weren't going to let me slink away quietly. You always have a choice. You chose courage." Grace took a drink. "My mother died when I was 12. My father never remarried, said he'd rather be alone than settle for someone who couldn't match her. He raised me to run this ranch, taught me everything he knew about business and land and people. But he also taught me that sometimes you have to fight, even when the odds are terrible, because some things are worth fighting for." "He sounds like a good man." "He is, but he's dying." Grace's voice cracked slightly. "The doctors give him maybe 6 months. Every day he's a little weaker, a little more confused. Soon I'll be running this ranch completely alone, trying to keep 40 hands employed and dozens of families fed, and dealing with men like Caldwell who think I have no right to that authority because of my gender." Arabella reached across the table, covered Grace's hand with her own. "You're not alone. You have Daniel. You have the women who spoke up tonight. You have me, for whatever that's worth." "It's worth everything." Grace squeezed her hand. "You've given us something to fight for beyond just survival, a vision of what this community could be if we educated our children properly. If we gave everyone, women, ranch families, anyone willing to learn, the tools to build better lives." They talked until well past midnight, about the hearing 6 weeks away, about strategy and evidence and allies, about what it meant to build something that challenged every assumption frontier society was built on. When Grace finally left, Arabella stood on her porch, watching the stars. Somewhere in England, her old life continued without her. Dinner parties and social calls and carefully maintained appearances. She didn't miss it, not even a little. The next morning, she woke to find a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was crude but determined. "Miss Arabella, Ma says I should write you proper thanks for teaching me, but I don't want to thank you. I want to ask you something. You said we could be more than what people expect. You said we could change things. Did you mean it? Or was that just nice words to make us feel better? Because if you meant it, I need to know how. How do I become someone who matters when everyone says I'm just a ranch kid who don't know nothing?" Thomas Arabella carried the note to her morning class, her heart heavy with the weight of responsibility. When the children assembled, she held up Thomas's letter. "Thomas asked me a question that deserves an honest answer," she said. "How do you become someone who matters when the world tells you you're nobody? Who wants to tackle that?" Clara raised her hand. "You learn everything you can?" "That's part of it. What else?" "You don't believe them when they say you're nobody," one of the younger girls offered. "Yes, but that's hard when everyone around you reinforces that message. So what do you do?" Silence. Then Sarah, sitting in the back with Emily, spoke up. "You find people who see your worth, who remind you it's real. Then you build from there." "Exactly." Arabella set down the letter. "Thomas, you asked how you become someone who matters. You already matter. You always have. The question is how you make other people recognize it, and the answer is this: you become undeniable. You learn so much, think so clearly, Speak so effectively that people can't dismiss you anymore. You earn credentials they have to respect. You build alliances with people who share your vision. You document everything so your achievements speak for themselves. She looked around at their faces. Young, old, scared, determined. In 6 weeks, we'll face a hearing that could shut us down. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to work harder than we ever have. We're going to master reading, writing, mathematics, history, and rhetoric. We're going to prepare presentations that demonstrate exactly what you've learned. We're going to show Judge Aldrich and anyone else who's watching that education isn't dangerous. Ignorance is. Are you with me? Yes, they said in unison. Good. Then let's get to work. The next 6 weeks were brutal. Arabella pushed the children harder than ever, but they rose to meet her expectations. Thomas began studying law, devouring every legal text Arabella could find. Clara focused on mathematics, solving problems that would challenge students twice her age. The younger children worked on literacy and public speaking, learning to express themselves clearly and persuasively. Sarah and the other mothers attended evening sessions where Arabella taught them about contracts, property law, and civic participation. They learned how to read legal documents, how to identify exploitation, how to advocate for themselves. And Daniel became her partner in ways she hadn't anticipated. He helped her refine arguments, challenge assumptions, think strategically about the hearing. Their evening sessions evolved from teacher-student to genuine collaboration, each pushing the other to think more deeply. "What if we lose?" he asked one night, 3 weeks before the hearing. "Then we lose having fought for something that matters," Arabella said. "But I don't think we will. Judge Aldrich is fair, and we're building an overwhelming case. Caldwell won't give up easily." "No, but he's fighting to preserve his ego. We're fighting for children's futures. I like our motivation better than his." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. "Can I tell you something, and you won't think I'm being inappropriate?" Arabella felt her heart speed up slightly. "You can tell me anything. I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them. Arabella's first instinct was panic. This wasn't part of the plan. Relationships were complicated. She was too old for this. They had too much at stake to risk it. But beneath the panic was something else, something warm and terrifying and undeniable. "Daniel," she said slowly, "I'm 52 years old. I'm battle-scarred and difficult and probably going to cause you nothing but trouble. I know. I'm not interested in being taken care of or protected or made respectable. I know that too. I spent 30 years in a marriage where I made myself small. I won't do that again. I'm not asking you to." Daniel leaned forward. "I'm asking if you'd be interested in partnership, real partnership, between equals who challenge each other and grow together. Because watching you these past months, the way you think, the way you fight, the way you refuse to compromise your principles, I've never met anyone like you, and I don't want to miss the chance to build something with you." Arabella felt tears prick her eyes. "That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me, and the most terrifying." "I can work with terrifying," she laughed, surprising herself. "Can we table this until after the hearing? Not because I'm not interested, but because I need to focus on the children right now. They're depending on me, and I can't afford distraction." "I can wait." Daniel stood. "But Arabella? When this is over, whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere. Take all the time you need to decide what you want. I'll be here." After he left, Arabella sat in the darkness, her mind racing. She'd spent so long believing she was past the age of new beginnings, past the possibility of partnership, past everything except quiet decline into old age. Daniel was offering her something different, not rescue, not comfort, but challenge and growth, and the terrifying possibility of being fully seen by someone who valued what he saw. She wanted it. That was the shocking part. After Edward's death, she'd assumed romance was finished for her. But this wasn't romance in the conventional sense. It was recognition. Two people who'd lived complex lives, made mistakes, learned hard lessons, and emerged ready for something real. But first, the hearing. First, protecting the children and the future they deserved. Everything else could wait. The night before the hearing, Arabella couldn't sleep. She went through her notes one final time, checking every argument, every piece of evidence, every potential counter-argument. Thomas and Clara would testify about their educational progress. Sarah and Margaret would speak about community impact. Grace would present test scores and attendance records. Judge Aldrich would decide. A soft knock interrupted her preparation. She opened the door to find all 7 children standing there, plus Sarah with Emily. "We wanted to say something," Thomas said, "before tomorrow." They filed into her small cabin, crowding around the table. Clara handed her a folded piece of paper. "We wrote this together," the girl explained, "to thank you, but also to promise you something." Arabella unfolded the paper. The handwriting was careful, clearly copied multiple times to get it perfect. "Dear Miss Arabella, you taught us that our minds are our own, that we have worth beyond what other people decide, that education is power and power is responsibility. Tomorrow they might try to take our school away, but they can't take what you've already given us. We're different now. We think differently. We see the world differently. And we promise you this, whatever happens tomorrow, we won't forget. We'll keep learning, we'll keep questioning, we'll keep fighting for what's right, because that's what you taught us to do. You saved us from lives of ignorance. We'll spend the rest of our lives proving you were right to believe in us. Your students." Arabella's vision blurred with tears. She looked at their faces. These children who'd been wild and undisciplined 6 weeks ago, now standing before her with dignity and purpose. "Thank you," she managed, "for trusting me, for working so hard, for being brave enough to imagine something better." "We learned it from you," Sarah said softly. After they left, Arabella sat alone with the letter, the weight of tomorrow pressing down. Win or lose, these children were changed. That was victory enough. But she wanted more. She wanted the chance to keep teaching them, to watch them grow into adults who questioned and challenged and demanded better. She wanted to prove that education wasn't dangerous, it was essential. She wanted to win. The hearing was held in Copper Springs Courthouse, a 2-story building that seemed to strain under the weight of its own importance. Arabella arrived early with Grace and Daniel, her best dress pressed, and her notes organized in a leather folder Daniel had given her the night before. The courtroom was already filling, ranchers, townspeople, and what looked like half the population of Red Mesa Ranch crowding into the wooden benches. Victor Caldwell sat in the front row, his expensive suit a sharp contrast to the work-worn clothes around him. Beside him, Harrison Webb shuffled papers with the nervous energy of a man who knew his case was weak. 2 other education board members flanked them, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Judge Aldrich entered precisely at 9, his black robes lending gravity to his already commanding presence. Everyone stood, then settled as he took his seat. "This hearing will determine whether Red Mesa Ranch's educational program violates territorial statutes," Aldrich began, his voice carrying easily. "Mr. Webb, you filed the complaint. Present your case." Webb stood, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the Education Board has serious concerns about the curriculum and methods employed by Lady Arabella Whitcroft. While we acknowledge that test scores have improved, we believe the content being taught is inappropriate for frontier children and potentially dangerous to community stability." Specifically? Aldrich's tone suggested he had little patience for vagueness. "Lady Whitcroft teaches political philosophy, encourages children to question legitimate authority, and promotes ideas about equality and social reform that are beyond the comprehension and needs of ranch families." Webb pulled out his notes. "We have testimony from concerned citizens about lessons on revolution, workers' rights, and gender equality, subjects that have no place in basic frontier education." "I see. And which territorial statute prohibits teaching these subjects?" Webb faltered. "It's not explicitly prohibited, but the spirit of the educational guidelines—" "Mr. Webb, I asked which statute. If you can't cite one, sit down." Webb sat, his face flushed. Caldwell leaned over, whispered something urgent. Webb stood again. "Your Honor, we believe this falls under Section 7, which requires educational content to be appropriate to the age and station of students. Teaching ranch children about philosophical concepts and political theory exceeds their station and serves no practical purpose." "Their station?" Aldrich's eyebrows rose. "Are you arguing that education should be limited based on social class?" "I'm arguing that education should be practical. These children need to learn skills relevant to their likely futures: ranching, domestic work, basic trades. Philosophy and political theory are luxuries they'll never use." Interesting theory. Let's hear from the defense, Miss Holloway. Grace stood, and Arabella felt a surge of pride at her friend's composure. Your Honor, Red Mesa Ranch employs Lady Whitcroft to educate our children. In 10 weeks, she's achieved remarkable results. Thomas Brennan, who could barely read when she arrived, now reads at a high school level. Clara Mitchell has advanced 2 years in mathematics. Every child in the program has shown significant improvement in literacy, critical thinking, and communication skills. She handed a folder to the bailiff, who passed it to Aldrich. These are the test scores, attendance records, and work samples. We're not just teaching them to memorize facts, we're teaching them to think. And thinking, Your Honor, is relevant to any future. The board doesn't dispute improvement in basic skills, Webb interjected. Our concern is the supplementary content, which is what makes the improvement possible, Grace cut in. Lady Whitcroft doesn't teach reading through dry primers. She uses philosophy, history, and literature to engage students who were previously uninterested in education. The content isn't supplementary, it's essential to the method. Aldrich studied the documents, his expression unreadable. I'd like to hear from Lady Whitcroft herself. Ma'am, approach the bench. Arabella stood, her legs steadier than she'd expected. She faced Aldrich, aware of every eye in the courtroom on her. Lady Whitcroft, explain your educational philosophy in plain terms. Your Honor, I believe that all children, regardless of class, gender, or circumstances, deserve to understand the world they live in and their place within it. I teach reading through literature because stories engage the imagination. I teach mathematics through practical problems because numbers need context. And I teach philosophy and history because understanding how societies function gives students tools to navigate and potentially improve their own society. And you don't believe this exceeds what ranch children need? I believe it's exactly what they need. Sir, these children will face exploitation, manipulation, and injustice throughout their lives. Someone will try to cheat them on a contract, pay them unfair wages, or convince them they have no right to better treatment. If I teach them only to read and calculate, they'll be literate victims. If I teach them to think critically, to question, to understand power structures, they'll have a fighting chance at determining their own futures. That sounds like you're training revolutionaries, not students. I'm training citizens. There's a difference. Caldwell shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is exactly the problem. She admits she's teaching children to challenge authority, to question their betters. Their betters? Arabella turned to face him, something hot and fierce rising in her chest. And who determines who's better, Mr. Caldwell? You? Based on what criteria? Wealth you inherited? Education you were given by accident of birth? You rejected me because I refused to pretend stupidity for your comfort, and now you want to ensure these children never develop the intellect that threatened you. That's not about protecting them. It's about protecting your own sense of superiority. How dare you? How dare I what? Speak truth? You've built your entire argument on the assumption that some people, based purely on birth and circumstance, deserve more opportunity than others. I reject that assumption entirely. These children are as capable of complex thought as any child in Boston or New York. They simply haven't had the chance to prove it. I'm giving them that chance. Order, Aldrich said, but mildly. Mr. Caldwell, sit down. Lady Whitcroft, continue. Arabella took a breath, forcing herself to speak calmly. Your Honor, I'm 52 years old. I spent 30 years in a marriage where my education was considered a liability rather than an asset. I was told to be quiet, agreeable, decorative. When my husband died, I had a choice: continue living that diminished life or try to build something meaningful. I chose meaning. These children deserve the same choice, even if that choice leads them to reject their parents' values or way of life. Especially then, because blind acceptance isn't loyalty, it's ignorance. If these children grow up and choose to work ranches, I want them choosing it because they understand the options and value that life, not because they never knew anything else existed. Aldrich was quiet for a long moment. I'd like to hear from the students. Thomas Brennan. Approach. Thomas stood, his face pale, but determined. He walked to the front of the courtroom with his shoulders back, every inch of him fighting not to show fear. Son, tell me what you've learned in the past 10 weeks. I've learned to read, Your Honor. Really read, not just sound out words. I've learned mathematics, history, philosophy, and rhetoric. But more than that, Thomas's voice grew stronger. I've learned that my mind matters, that I can understand complex ideas, that I have a right to question things that don't make sense. Give me an example. Well, sir, I learned about property rights and labor laws, and I realized that the contract my ma signed when she started working at the ranch kitchen, it wasn't fair. It paid less than what men doing similar work got, and it had clauses that basically meant she could be fired anytime but couldn't quit without penalty. So I helped her negotiate a new contract, a fair one. Webb stood quickly. Your Honor, this proves our point. He's using education to undermine legitimate business arrangements. He's using education to ensure his mother isn't exploited, Grace interrupted. I approved the new contract, by the way. Thomas was right. The old one was unconscionable. I'd been using my father's old contracts without reviewing them properly. Thomas caught something I missed. Aldrich looked at Thomas. How old are you, son? 13, sir. And you negotiated a labor contract? Miss Arabella taught me how to read legal language and identify unfair terms. Then I practiced arguing my position respectfully but firmly. It took 3 tries before Miss Holloway agreed, but I had the evidence on my side. What do you want to be when you grow up? Thomas straightened. A lawyer, sir. I want to help people who don't have the education to protect themselves. Miss Arabella says I'd be good at it, and I intend to prove her right. Something shifted in Aldrich's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. You may sit. Clara Mitchell, approach. Clara came forward, smaller than Thomas, but just as composed. Arabella felt her heart swell with pride. Miss Mitchell, what's the most important thing you've learned? That I'm not stupid, Your Honor. Clara's voice was clear and firm. I thought I was, before Miss Arabella. I couldn't keep up with the boys in ranch work, and I figured that meant I wasn't good at anything. But Miss Arabella showed me I'm good at mathematics. Really good. She's been teaching me algebra and geometry, and I understand it better than kids twice my age. She says I could go to college if I want. Nobody ever told me that was possible before. And what would you study in college? Engineering, maybe, or architecture. I like solving problems, figuring out how things work. Miss Arabella says women can do those things now, in some places. I'd like to be one of them. Webb stood again. Your Honor, this is precisely the problem. These children are being given unrealistic expectations. Unrealistic by whose measure? Aldrich's voice was sharp. This girl clearly has aptitude for mathematics. Why shouldn't she pursue engineering? Because she's a ranch girl from a poor family. She'll never have the resources or opportunities. She's a ranch girl with documented mathematical ability and a teacher willing to prepare her. Aldrich leaned forward. Mr. Webb, your argument seems to be that we should limit education based on what you believe children's futures will be. But education is precisely what allows people to exceed those limitations. If we only taught children skills relevant to their current circumstances, we'd ensure they never escape those circumstances. But the cost, Your Honor, what cost? Lady Whitcroft is working for room and board. The ranch provides space. The only cost is to people like Mr. Caldwell, whose sense of superiority requires others to remain ignorant. Aldrich shuffled his papers. I'd like to hear from the mothers. Sarah Brennan, is it? Sarah stood, Emily on her hip. She approached the bench with visible nervousness, but her voice didn't shake. Your Honor, I'm 19 years old. I got married at 16 because I had no other options. I love my husband and my daughter, but I wish I'd had choices. Miss Arabella is giving Emily those choices. She's teaching her to read, to think, to believe she has worth beyond what men decide. That's not dangerous. That's salvation. Strong word, Aldrich observed. Accurate word. Sarah met his eyes. I was drowning in ignorance, Your Honor. I didn't even know how little I knew. Miss Arabella threw me a rope. Now I can read contracts, understand my legal rights, advocate for myself and my family. My husband says I'm different, stronger, more confident. He likes it. Says he married me for who I am, not who I could pretend to be. And the content doesn't concern you? The philosophy? The political theory? The philosophy teaches me to think clearly about right and wrong. The political theory helps me understand why things are the way they are and how they might change. Why would that concern me? I want to understand the world, not just survive it blindly. Margaret spoke next, her weathered face fierce. My son can read legal documents. He can argue a position with evidence. He's not going to be taken advantage of the way I was. That's worth more than any practical skill you could name. One by one, the mothers testified about improved literacy, about children who asked questions and demanded answers, about hope for futures that looked different from the past. Their testimony was devastating in its simplicity. These weren't political radicals or social reformers. They were working mothers who wanted better for their children, and Arabella had shown them how to achieve it. When they finished, Aldrich called a brief recess. Arabella stepped outside, her legs shaking with delayed reaction. Daniel found her on the courthouse steps. "You're winning," he said quietly. "Maybe, but Caldwell has one more move. I can feel it." She was right. When the hearing resumed, Caldwell himself took the stand. "Your Honor, I'd like to present a different perspective. I'm a successful businessman, a pillar of this community. When I advertised for a wife, Lady Whitcroft responded. I rejected her, not because of her education, but because of her temperament. She was combative, unwilling to accept guidance, and inappropriately assertive for a woman of her age." Arabella felt rage flood through her, but Grace's hand on her arm kept her seated. "I mention this because it speaks to her character. She came to Red Mesa not out of noble motives, but because I rejected her. This entire educational program is her revenge, turning children against traditional values, undermining parental authority, all because she couldn't accept that she wasn't suitable as a wife." "That's a lie," Arabella said, standing despite Grace's restraining hand. "Lady Whitcroft," Aldrich started. "Your Honor, may I respond?" Aldrich studied her, then nodded. "Approach." Arabella walked forward, her hands clenched to stop them from trembling. She faced Caldwell directly. "You rejected me because I refused to pretend stupidity for your ego, because I had opinions and wasn't afraid to express them, because I was educated and you found that threatening. Everything else is justification." She turned to Aldrich. "He's right about one thing. I came to Red Mesa because he rejected me. Daniel Mercer overheard the rejection and offered me a job teaching. I accepted because I wanted purpose, not revenge. And yes, I'm combative when people try to silence me. I'm assertive when defending what I believe in. And I'm absolutely unwilling to accept guidance that requires me to diminish myself." "Those are not appropriate qualities in a woman," Caldwell said. "Says who? You? The men who profit from women's silence?" Arabella's voice rose. "I spent 30 years being appropriate, being quiet, agreeable, decorative, and I was miserable. These children will not be raised to be ornamental. They'll be raised to be useful, thoughtful, and engaged. If that's inappropriate, then appropriateness is worthless." "Your Honor, this outburst proves my point." "No, Mr. Caldwell, it proves hers." Aldrich's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "You rejected Lady Whitcroft for qualities that make her an excellent teacher: intelligence, assertiveness, unwillingness to accept unjust limitations. Then you attempted to destroy her educational program because its success proved you wrong. This isn't about protecting children, it's about protecting your ego. That's not enough. I've heard sufficient testimony." Aldrich gathered his papers. "Here is my ruling. The territorial education statutes do not prohibit teaching philosophy, political theory, or critical thinking. They explicitly encourage development of reasoning faculties and civic understanding. Lady Whitcroft's curriculum aligns with those goals. The test scores and testimony demonstrate clear educational value. Therefore, the cease order is permanently dissolved. Red Mesa Ranch may continue its educational program without restriction." Relief crashed through Arabella so powerfully she had to grab the rail for support. "However," Aldrich continued, "I'm adding a requirement. Lady Whitcroft will submit quarterly reports documenting student progress, curriculum content, and educational outcomes. This will create a record proving that frontier children can handle complex material, which may inform future territorial education policy." "Your Honor, this sets a dangerous precedent," Webb tried. "Good. I hope it does. I hope every ranch, every mining camp, every frontier settlement realizes that their children deserve real education, not just basic literacy." Dismissed. The courtroom erupted. Women from the ranch were crying, children cheering. Caldwell stormed out without a word, Webb scurrying after him. Grace pulled Arabella into a fierce hug. "You did it," Grace said. "You actually did it." "We did it," Arabella corrected. "All of us." Thomas pushed through the crowd. Clara right behind him. Does this mean you're staying? It means I'm staying, Arabella confirmed, and found herself surrounded by children, all of them talking at once, their joy palpable. Daniel hung back, watching with a smile that made her heart skip. When the crowd finally dispersed, he approached. Congratulations, he said simply. Thank you, for everything, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. I just recognized what was already there. He paused. Remember what I said? About waiting until after the hearing? Arabella felt her pulse quicken. I remember. The hearing's over. And I'm still interested in that partnership I mentioned, if you are. She looked at him, this quiet, thoughtful man who'd given her a second chance, who valued her mind as much as anything else, who'd stood beside her through everything, who saw her completely and wanted her anyway. I'm terrified, she admitted. Of me? Of this. Of caring about someone again. Of risking my independence. I'm not asking for your independence. I'm asking to join you in it. Daniel took her hand carefully, as if she might bolt. Arabella, I don't want to own you or control you or diminish you. I want to stand beside you while you change the world. Is that something you'd consider? She thought of Edward, who'd wanted her silent and ornamental. She thought of Caldwell, who'd rejected her for refusing to submit. And then she thought of Daniel, who'd never once asked her to be less than she was. Yes, she said. I'd consider it, but slowly, carefully. I can do slowly and carefully. And you'll have to accept that I'll probably drive you insane with stubbornness. Already planning on it? She laughed, the sound surprising her. All right then, let's see what we can build. He kissed her hand, formal and respectful, and she felt something warm settle in her chest. Not the wild passion of youth, something steadier, deeper. Partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and the understanding that they were both complicated people who'd lived complex lives. That evening, Red Mesa Ranch celebrated. Grace brought out whiskey that her father had been saving for a special occasion. The ranch hands built a bonfire. Someone produced a fiddle, and soon there was music and dancing and the kind of joy that came from winning a battle everyone said was unwinnable. Arabella stood apart from the celebration for a moment, watching. Sarah danced with her husband, Emily laughing in his arms. Thomas sat with several other boys, already planning their futures with the confidence of people who believed in their own potential. Clara was showing some of the younger children a geometric puzzle, her face alight with the pleasure of sharing knowledge. Grace found her, pressed a glass into her hand. What are you thinking? That I spent 30 years feeling useless, and now I've helped create this. Arabella gestured at the celebration. People who believe in themselves, who understand their worth, who won't accept limitations others try to impose. That's what education should do. You know this is just the beginning, right? Word will spread. Other ranches will want teachers. The territory will have to address frontier education more seriously. You've started something that's going to outlive all of us. Good. Let it outlive us. Let it become so normal that nobody remembers when it was radical. Daniel approached, offered his hand. Dance with me? Arabella hadn't danced in years. Hadn't wanted to, but she took his hand and let him lead her into the circle of firelight. They moved together carefully, finding their rhythm, two people learning to navigate shared space. What happens now? He asked. Now. We keep teaching. We expand the program. We document everything so it can be replicated. We prove that frontier children can achieve anything their urban counterparts can. And us? What happens with us? Arabella looked up at him, this man who'd offered her purpose when she needed it most, who'd stood beside her through every battle, who wanted partnership rather than possession. We figure it out as we go. Build something neither of us has had before, a relationship between equals. Sounds complicated. It will be. Worth it, though. Definitely worth it. They danced until the fire burned low, until children began falling asleep in their mother's arms, until the celebration wound down to quiet conversations and the distant cry of coyotes. When Arabella finally returned to her cabin, she found another note slipped under her door, this one from all the mothers. Dear Lady Whitcroft, you gave us hope, not false hope, not empty promises, but real hope backed by real tools. Our children will have futures we never imagined possible. That's not a small thing. That's everything. Thank you for refusing to accept that we deserved less than anyone else. Thank you for fighting when it would have been easier to quit. Thank you for seeing worth in us that we'd stopped seeing in ourselves. With deepest gratitude and respect, the mothers of Red Mesa Ranch. Arabella sat on her bed, the note in her hands, and let herself cry. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of having mattered, of having taken her pain, her rejection, her anger at a world that had no place for her, and transformed it into something that changed other people's lives. She'd come to Red Mesa Ranch broken, dismissed, cast aside as too much of everything. She was leaving that version of herself behind, becoming someone new. Not younger, not somehow restored to youth, but fully herself for the first time in decades. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly under stars that had witnessed countless transformations. Arabella opened her journal and began to write, documenting the day's victory, planning next quarter's curriculum, sketching out ideas for expanding the program. There was so much work ahead. Other ranches to reach, more children to teach, battles to fight against people who preferred ignorance to empowerment. But she wasn't alone anymore. She had Grace's strategic mind, Daniel's steady support, and a community of women who'd learned to use their voices. Most importantly, she had purpose. Real, meaningful purpose that would outlive her physical presence. These children would carry what she taught them into their own futures, would pass it on to their own children, would build a world where education wasn't a luxury, but a right. Arabella Whitcroft, 52 years old, rejected and dismissed, had found something her aristocratic upbringing had never prepared her for. The profound satisfaction of being truly useful, of taking knowledge that had been locked inside her unused and weaponizing it for good. She fell asleep with her journal open, ink drying on pages full of plans and possibilities. Tomorrow she'd wake early and begin again, teaching, pushing, challenging, refusing to accept that anyone's potential was limited by anything except their own choices. The noblewoman who'd been cast aside had found her kingdom. It wasn't built of stone and title, but of minds expanded, futures opened, and the revolutionary idea that every person, regardless of birth, gender, or circumstances, deserved the tools to determine their own fate. And she'd defend that kingdom with everything she had. 6 months after the hearing, on a morning when frost still clung to the edges of window panes, Victor Caldwell returned to Red Mesa Ranch. Arabella saw him from the barn loft where she was teaching, his expensive carriage rolling up the main road with an arrogance that made her jaw tighten. She continued her lesson on constitutional law. Thomas was preparing to apply to law schools back east, and he needed to understand foundational principles. But part of her attention tracked Caldwell's progress toward the main house. "Miss Arabella?" Clara's voice pulled her back. "You stopped mid-sentence." "My apologies. Where were we?" "The tension between federal and state authority," Thomas supplied. "You were explaining why it matters for property rights." She refocused, pushing Caldwell from her mind. Whatever he wanted, Grace could handle it. The children deserved her full attention. But an hour later, when Grace appeared at the barn door, her expression told Arabella that Caldwell's visit concerned her directly. "Can we talk?" Grace asked. "It's important." Arabella assigned the children independent work and followed Grace outside. Daniel was already waiting, his face carefully neutral in a way that meant he was angry about something. "Caldwell's in my office," Grace said without preamble. "He wants to speak with you, privately." "Absolutely not," Daniel said immediately. "Whatever he has to say, he can say it with witnesses present." "Agreed," Arabella said, though curiosity gnawed at her. "What does he want?" "He wouldn't tell me, but he's brought papers with him, legal documents." Grace's eyes were sharp. "And he looks different, diminished somehow." They walked to the main house together, Daniel's presence at Arabella's shoulder both protective and supportive. Caldwell stood when they entered, and Grace was right. Something had changed. His suit was still expensive, but it hung differently on him. His face was haggard, and his hands trembled slightly as he set down his coffee cup. "Lady Whitcroft," he said, "thank you for seeing me." "I'm not sure I'm seeing you, Mr. Caldwell. I'm simply present in the same room." Arabella sat, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her unsettled. "State your business." He flinched. "I deserve that. I deserve worse, honestly." He pulled out a chair, moving like a man twice his age. "I came to apologize, and to make an offer." "An apology?" Arabella raised an eyebrow. How unexpected. I was wrong. About you, about the education program, about everything. Caldwell's voice was rough. 6 months ago, my business partner discovered I'd been mismanaging funds, making poor investments, hiding losses. When the truth came out, half my ventures collapsed. I lost the majority of my wealth. I fail to see how this concerns me, Arabella said, though she felt a flicker of something, not quite sympathy, but not entirely cold either. It concerns you because in my desperation I sought advice from my remaining associates. One of them, Judge Aldrich actually, told me something that changed my perspective. Caldwell met her eyes. He said that the most valuable resource in any community isn't land or cattle or gold. It's educated people who can think strategically, solve problems, and adapt to changing circumstances. He said I'd rejected that resource when I rejected you and spent 6 months trying to destroy it because I couldn't admit my mistake. Daniel shifted beside her, his skepticism palpable. You came all this way to tell us you were wrong? That's unusually humble of you. I came because I want to make amends, and because I need your help. Caldwell pulled out the legal documents. I'm selling my remaining property in town, the building that houses the general store and 2 adjacent lots. The proceeds would be enough to construct a proper schoolhouse, not just for Red Mesa, but for the entire territory, a model program that could be replicated elsewhere. Arabella stared at him. You want to fund a school? I want to fund your school. You'd have complete control over curriculum, hiring, and operations. I'd provide the building and initial operating funds, then step aside. My only condition is that you name it something that reminds people education matters more than pride. He pushed the papers toward her. The Whitcroft Academy for Frontier Education. The room fell silent. Arabella's mind raced, examining the offer from every angle. It was too good, too convenient. There had to be a catch. Why? She asked bluntly. Why would you do this after fighting so hard to destroy me? Because I was wrong, and I want to be right before I die. Caldwell's laugh was bitter. The doctors give me maybe 2 years. Cancer. I spent my life building wealth and realized too late that I built nothing of value. You've built something that will outlive you. I want to contribute to that before it's too late for me. Grace leaned forward. If we accept this, what strings are attached? None. I'll have my lawyers draft documents ensuring complete autonomy for Lady Whitcroft and Red Mesa Ranch. I won't serve on any board, won't have input into operations. I simply want to help create something good before I'm gone. Arabella studied him, this man who'd rejected her so cruelly, who'd tried to destroy her work, who was now offering her the resources to expand beyond her wildest dreams. The skeptical part of her screamed that this was manipulation, another attempt to control her. But the part that had learned to see people clearly recognized something else. Genuine regret. The desperate need of a dying man to create meaning from the wreckage of a wasted life. I need time to consider this, she said finally. And I'll need my own lawyers to review any documents. Of course, take all the time you need. Caldwell stood. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm hoping you'll accept the opportunity to do more good, even if it comes from someone who tried to stop you. After he left, the 3 of them sat in heavy silence. It's a trap, Daniel said finally. It has to be. Maybe, Grace said, but if it's real, it's exactly what we need. We've had 3 other ranches ask about starting education programs. We could expand, train teachers, create a model that spreads across the territory, using money from the man who tried to destroy us, Arabella said quietly. There's a certain poetry in that. There's a certain risk in that, Daniel corrected. What if he uses the school to rehabilitate his reputation? What if he demands recognition, tries to control things from behind the scenes? Then we ensure the legal documents prevent that. Arabella stood, began pacing. I don't trust his motives, but I trust our ability to protect ourselves. And if we can use his guilt to create something genuinely valuable, we'd be fools not to try, Grace finished. I'll contact our lawyers. We'll make sure every possible protection is in place. Over the next month, lawyers pored over documents. Caldwell's offer was exactly what he'd claimed, a complete transfer of property and funds with no strings attached. The papers gave Arabella sole authority over the academy, with Grace as her designated successor. Caldwell's name would appear nowhere on the building or governance documents. It was, against all expectation, genuine. "I still don't like it," Daniel said the night before Arabella was set to sign the papers. They sat in her cabin, now larger than when she'd arrived. Daniel had built an addition himself, giving her space for a proper library and study. "You don't have to like it," Arabella said. "You just have to accept that I've made my decision." "Have you? Or are you still trying to prove something to him?" That stung because it held a kernel of truth. "Maybe I am. Maybe I want him to see what he rejected, to understand the magnitude of his mistake." That's pride talking, not wisdom. Can't it be both? She set down her teacup. "Daniel, I've spent this entire year learning to trust my own judgment, to believe I have worth beyond what men like Caldwell think of me. This isn't about proving anything to him. It's about accepting an opportunity to expand work that matters. And what about us? Where do I fit in this expanded vision?" Arabella heard the fear beneath his question. In the months since the hearing, they'd built something careful and real. Not the passionate romance of youth, but a partnership of equals who valued each other's minds as much as their companionship. They hadn't married, hadn't even discussed it seriously. Both of them carried too much history to rush into legal entanglements. But they'd created a life together, shared meals, shared work, shared late-night conversations that ranged across philosophy and politics and personal dreams. It was the healthiest relationship Arabella had ever had, precisely because it demanded nothing except mutual respect and continued growth. "You fit exactly where you've always fit," she said gently. "Beside me, as my partner, my equal. This doesn't change that unless you want it to. I don't want to be Mr. Arabella Whitcroft, tagging along while you change the world." "Good, because I don't want that either. I want Daniel Mercer, who challenges my thinking and calls me out when I'm being stubborn, and believes in this work as much as I do. That's not changing." He was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but I'm reviewing those documents one more time before you sign them." "I'd expect nothing less." The Whitcroft Academy opened 8 months later in a building that far exceeded Arabella's initial vision. 2 stories, 6 classrooms, a library, and living quarters for teachers. Caldwell attended the opening ceremony, standing in the back, speaking to no one. When Arabella gave her speech, thanking the community, outlining their educational philosophy, promising to serve all children regardless of circumstances, she saw him wipe his eyes. He died 3 months later. His will left his remaining wealth to the Academy's endowment, ensuring its financial stability for decades. Arabella stood at his funeral, not out of forgiveness, but out of recognition that people were complicated, capable of both harm and redemption. He'd been cruel, proud, and destructive. He'd also enabled her greatest achievement. Both things were true. "Are you all right?" Daniel asked as they walked away from the gravesite. "I'm not sure. I spent so long hating him. Now I just feel empty where that hate used to be." "That's probably healthy." "Healthy doesn't mean comfortable." He took her hand, their fingers interlacing naturally. "Nothing worth doing ever is." 2 years after the academy opened, Thomas graduated and was accepted to Harvard Law School with a full scholarship. Clara left for a mathematics program at a women's college in Massachusetts. 5 other students from that first class pursued higher education, a rate unheard of for frontier children. But the real success was the children who stayed, who became ranchers and ranch managers armed with literacy, critical thinking, and the confidence to demand fair treatment, who negotiated better contracts, understood their legal rights, and refused to accept exploitation quietly. Sarah became the Academy's first assistant teacher, her journey from barely literate teenager to educator, inspiring other young women. Margaret managed the Academy's finances with a precision that would have made any accountant proud. Eleanor started a lending library in town, ensuring books reached families who couldn't afford to travel to the Academy. The mothers who'd been dismissed as ignorant became leaders in their community, proving that education was never wasted, just denied. On Arabella's 55th birthday, Grace threw a celebration at the ranch. Current and former students came from across the territory bringing their own children, sharing stories of how education had changed their trajectories. Thomas sent a letter from Harvard, describing his cases and thanking her for seeing potential in an angry 13-year-old who defended his mother with his fists. Clara wrote from Massachusetts, explaining advanced mathematical theories with the kind of joy that came from finally finding her place in the world. And dozens of others, Children who'd been wild and undisciplined, now adults building meaningful lives, sent testimonies to the woman who'd refused to accept that birth determined destiny. That evening, after the celebration wound down, Arabella and Daniel sat on the porch of their shared cabin, a compromise they'd reached 2 years earlier, combining their spaces into something that belonged to both of them equally. 5 years, Daniel said, since you arrived dusty and furious and absolutely terrifying. I wasn't terrifying, I was desperate. You were both, still are sometimes. He smiled. I like it. Arabella leaned against him, comfortable in a way she'd never been with Edward. Do you ever regret it, tying yourself to someone as complicated as me? Every day. She pulled back, startled, and found him grinning. I regret it every day that I wake up and you've already started working without having coffee with me first. I regret it when you get so absorbed in lesson planning that you forget to eat. I regret it when you start arguments about philosophy at midnight because you can't stop thinking about some obscure point. He pulled her back against him. But I've never once regretted choosing you. Choosing this life, choosing partnership over easy comfort. Well, that's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me. I've been practicing. They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the main house, Grace was putting the finishing touches on next quarter's budget. Somewhere in town, children were reading by lamplight, hungry for knowledge. Somewhere across the territory, teachers trained at the academy were starting their own programs, spreading the radical idea that all children deserved real education. I've been thinking about something, Arabella said. When I die, eventually, not immediately, I don't want a gravestone that says Lady Arabella Whitcroft, beloved wife. I want one that says teacher, believed everyone deserved to think. We could do both. Could we? She looked up at him. I was thinking we could get married. Properly, I mean. But only if we can do it as equals. No obey in the vows, no property transfer, just partnership. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Are you proposing to me? I think I am. Is that allowed? I don't know. Let me check my handbook on proper frontier etiquette. He pretended to search his pockets. Oh, look, I don't have one. So I guess we make our own rules. Is that a yes? That's a yes, on one condition. What condition? You let me write my own vows, and they're going to be insufferably philosophical because you've ruined me for normal conversation. She laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine joy. Deal. They married 3 months later in a ceremony that scandalized half the territory and delighted the other half. Arabella wore deep blue instead of white. She was too old for virginal pretense, she said, and preferred honesty to convention. Daniel wore his best suit and stumbled through vows about epistemology and moral philosophy that made several people cry and others deeply confused. Judge Aldrich officiated, clearly enjoying himself. By the power invested in me by the territory, and more importantly by your mutual consent and equal commitment, I declare you partners in marriage and in purpose. You may now engage in whatever gesture of affection you've previously agreed upon. And they kissed, and the academy students cheered, and Arabella felt something settle in her chest that she'd never expected to feel again. Complete, uncomplicated happiness. 5 more years passed. The academy expanded again, adding a boarding program for children from remote ranches. Arabella trained 12 new teachers, each of them committed to the philosophy that education was power, and power was responsibility. Daniel began writing essays about frontier justice, about the intersection of philosophy and practical living, about building communities based on mutual respect rather than hierarchy. His work was published in Eastern journals, bringing attention to the territory and the radical educational experiment happening there. People began visiting the academy, studying their methods, asking how to replicate their success. Arabella became a reluctant celebrity. Universities invited her to speak. Educational conferences wanted her expertise. She turned down most invitations, preferring to focus on the work rather than discussing it. But occasionally she accepted, using the platform to argue that education was a right, not a privilege, and that society's failure to educate all children was both morally indefensible and economically foolish. On her 60th birthday, the territorial governor visited the academy and announced a new program. Teacher training centers modeled on Whitcroft's methods, funded by territorial taxes, designed to ensure every child had access to real education regardless of location or economic status. You've changed the territory, the governor said in his speech. Not through politics or violence, but through the revolutionary act of teaching children to think. That's a legacy that will outlive all of us. That night, Arabella wrote in her journal she'd filled dozens over the years, documenting lessons learned, methods refined, student successes and failures. 10 years ago, I stood in Victor Caldwell's parlor and heard him dismiss me as too educated, too opinionated, too old to control. I thought my life was ending. I couldn't have been more wrong. My life didn't end that day. It began. Everything before. The titled marriage, the London townhouse, the careful performance of aristocratic femininity. That was preparation. Painful, frustrating preparation for this. Building something that matters from the ground up. I'm 60 years old. My hair is gray, my back aches in the mornings, and I can't read fine print without spectacles. I'm also more myself than I've ever been. More useful, more purposeful, more genuinely happy. The children I taught that first year are adults now, building lives of meaning and dignity. Thomas argues cases that challenge unjust laws. Clara designs bridges that connect remote communities. Sarah trains new teachers, passing on what she learned, and dozens of others, hundreds now, across the territory, carry forward the idea that thinking for yourself is both a right and a responsibility. That's legacy. Not bloodlines or inherited titles, but ideas that spread, take root, and change the world. 3 months later, Daniel came home from town with news that made Arabella's hands shake. A publisher in Boston wanted to turn her teaching methods into a textbook for frontier educators. They were offering a contract, an advance, and national distribution. "I'm not a writer," she protested. "You've written hundreds of lesson plans, thousands of pages of documentation. You just need to organize it for a broader audience." Daniel spread the contract on their table. This could change education across the entire country. Not just territories, but established states, too. Your methods could become standard practice. Or they could be watered down, made safe and conventional, stripped of everything that makes them effective. Not if you're the one writing the book. Not if you maintain creative control. He pointed to a clause. "I already negotiated that part. They publish what you write, not some edited version that removes the challenging parts." Arabella read the contract carefully. Her legal literacy, honed through years of reviewing Academy documents, helping her identify potential problems. But Daniel was right. This was an opportunity to spread their ideas far beyond what she could accomplish through direct teaching. "I'll need help," she said finally. "Research, editing, organization? I'm already planning to take a sabbatical from ranch work. We'll do it together." The book took 18 months to write. Arabella poured everything into it. Her philosophy of education, specific lesson plans, case studies from students, practical advice for teachers facing skeptical communities. She documented failures as honestly as successes, arguing that education was messy, complicated, and absolutely essential. Daniel edited, challenged her thinking, and contributed sections on community resistance and how to navigate it. Together, they created something that was part textbook, part manifesto, part love letter to the potential of human minds. Thinking for Themselves, A Practical Guide to Frontier Education, was published in 1889, when Arabella was 62. It sold modestly at first, then gained momentum as teachers across the country discovered it. Within 5 years, it was required reading in teacher training programs from California to Maine. Arabella received letters from educators who'd implemented her methods, from students whose lives had been changed, from parents who'd learned to read alongside their children. Each letter confirmed what she'd always believed. Education wasn't about filling empty vessels, but about lighting fires that would burn long after the teacher was gone. On her 65th birthday, Arabella woke to find Daniel already up, coffee made, and the morning newspaper spread on their table. He pointed to an article about educational reform in New York, which cited her book extensively. "You're changing the country without leaving Arizona," he said. "We're changing the country," she corrected. "This was never just me." "No, but you started it. You had the courage to begin when everything seemed impossible." She thought about that courage, how it hadn't felt like courage at the time, just desperation, anger, and a refusal to accept that her life was over at 52. How that desperation had transformed into purpose, that anger into fuel for change. "I wonder what I would tell her," she said quietly. "That woman standing in Caldwell's parlor, hearing she was unwanted? What would I say? What would you say?" That rejection isn't ending, it's redirection. That being too much for someone who wants you small is actually being exactly enough for work that matters. That the life you build from wreckage can be stronger than anything you could have built from comfort. She looked at Daniel, and that partnership, real partnership between equals, is worth waiting for, even if you have to wait 50 years to find it. He kissed her forehead. That's wisdom. That's experience. There's a difference. 10 years later, when Arabella was 75 and Daniel was 66, they made a decision together. The academy was thriving under younger leadership, teachers they'd trained, administrators who understood their philosophy. Their book was in its 12th printing. Educational reform movements across the country cited their work as inspiration. It was time to step back, not because they were finished, but because they'd built something that no longer needed them to survive. They spent their final years traveling, visiting former students, seeing how different communities had adapted their methods, documenting new approaches to frontier education. Arabella spoke at universities when invited, always emphasizing that she wasn't exceptional, just stubborn enough to refuse limitations others tried to impose. Anyone can do this, she told audiences. You don't need aristocratic education or special gifts. You just need to believe that all people, regardless of age, gender, class, or circumstance, deserve the tools to determine their own fate. Everything else follows from that belief. On a spring morning 3 months after her 78th birthday, Arabella woke with Daniel beside her in a small cabin they'd rented in Colorado. They'd been visiting a school started by one of Clara's former classmates, watching children engage with mathematics and philosophy with the same fierce joy that had characterized that first class at Red Mesa. I think I'm dying, she said calmly. Daniel sat up immediately. What? Are you in pain? No, I just know. The way you know sometimes. She took his hand. I'm not afraid. I've had more life in the past 26 years than most people get in a century. I'm not afraid. Though he held her, and she could feel him shaking. I'm not ready. You are. You've always been ready. You'll keep writing, keep advocating, keep pushing for the work we started. And when it's your time, you'll go knowing you built something that mattered. I love you. I've loved you since the moment I heard you tell Caldwell you'd rather have integrity than security. I know. I loved you when you offered me purpose instead of pity. She touched his face. Thank you for seeing me. All of me. Not the performance, but the person. They talked through the morning, revisiting memories, laughing about mistakes, crying about losses. As the sun climbed higher, Arabella felt herself growing tired, her breath becoming labored. Promise me something, she said. Don't let them make me respectable in death. Don't let them turn me into a sweet old teacher who gently encouraged children. I was difficult, stubborn, and absolutely refused to accept that anyone's potential was limited by anything except their own choices. Promise me that's what you'll tell them. I promise. She closed her eyes, Daniel's hand in hers, and felt something like peace. Not because her work was finished, it would never be finished, that was the nature of education, but because she'd proven something essential, that it was never too late to begin again, to build meaning from rejection, to become who you were always meant to be. Lady Arabella Whitcroft died that afternoon, surrounded by books and love, and the certainty that she'd mattered. Her funeral was held at the academy 3 weeks later. Hundreds attended, former students, teachers she'd trained, families whose lives had been changed by access to education. Thomas, now a prominent lawyer, delivered the eulogy. Clara, a celebrated engineer, read from Arabella's letters. Sarah, the academy's director, spoke about transformation and the power of believing in people. Daniel sat in the front row, accepting condolences with grace, knowing that grief was the price of genuine partnership. The gravestone they'd chosen together read exactly what Arabella had requested. Arabella Whitcroft Mercer, 1833 to 1911. Teacher. Believed everyone deserved to think. Wife, partner, friend. Refused to accept that age, gender, or circumstance determined worth. The academy continued, growing and evolving. Daniel lived another 12 years, writing and speaking about educational philosophy, always crediting Arabella while insisting the ideas belonged to everyone who'd fought for them. When he died, he was buried beside her, his gravestone reading simply, Daniel Mercer, thought alongside her. 50 years later, A young woman named Elena stood in front of Arabella's gravestone, reading the inscription. She was 22, the first in her family to attend college, studying to become a teacher. In her bag was a worn copy of Thinking for Themselves, required reading for her education program. "Thank you," Elena whispered to the stone, "for starting something that reached even me." She didn't know Arabella's full story, didn't know about Caldwell's rejection, the desperate journey to Arizona, the battles fought and barely won. She just knew that somewhere in the past, a teacher had believed that all children deserved real education, and that belief had rippled forward through decades, creating opportunities for girls like Elena who'd been told higher education wasn't for people like them. That was legacy. Not the details, but the impact. The idea taking root and spreading, changing lives in ways the original teacher would never witness. Arabella Whitcroft had been cast aside at 52, dismissed as too educated, too opinionated, too old to matter. She'd spent the next 26 years proving that assessment catastrophically wrong, not through becoming someone else, but through becoming more fully herself than society had ever allowed. She'd taken her pain and her anger and her brilliant, underutilized mind and built something that outlived her physical presence. She'd shown that reinvention wasn't reserved for the young, that partnership could be based on equality rather than domination, and that education was the most revolutionary act possible. Her students carried her forward, not perfectly, not without mistakes, but with the fundamental understanding that thinking for yourself was both right and responsibility. They became teachers, lawyers, engineers, business owners, parents who valued their children's minds. They built on her foundation, expanding and improving, adapting her methods for new contexts. And somewhere, in a dusty Arizona barn that had been converted into a museum, Arabella's first lesson plans were preserved behind glass. Visitors could see her handwriting, read her notes about individual students, trace the evolution of her thinking. But the real preservation was in the thousands of people across the country who'd learned to think critically, question authority, and demand better. All because a 52-year-old woman had refused to accept that rejection meant the end of her story. It had been instead the beginning of her greatest chapter, the one where she proved that worth wasn't measured in beauty or youth or submission to male authority, but in courage, purpose, and the revolutionary act of helping others discover their own power. Arabella Whitcroft had been too educated, too opinionated, too old, too much of everything that threatened men like Caldwell, and that had made her exactly right for changing the world.